Hello and good morning, friends. Welcome to the CEC-UGC live lecture. Dear friends, with our ongoing series on women and history, today we would be talking on women, education and writing in colonial India. Dear friends, this lecture is extension of the previous lecture which was on women education, and today we would be discussing in detail on the writings in the past. So, dear friends, for this very discussion, we have once again with us in our studios Dr. Shruti Vip. Dr. Shruti Vip is Assistant Professor in Department of History, PGDAV, Evening College, University of Delhi. So, let's welcome our guest, Dr. Shruti Vip, and let's try to get in-depth knowledge on the topic. Hello, ma'am. Welcome to the lecture.
Thanks for giving me this opportunity again to complete the series that we have started. As in the last lecture, I had discussed in detail about the various initiatives regarding women's education. I would be continuing from there. In addition to that, we would be discussing in detail a very interesting aspect, and that is the writings that were attempted by women during the 19th and the 20th centuries, which gives us a peep not only into their world, but also it tells us a lot about the contemporary socio-political, cultural, economic facets of life that was changing as an impact of not only the colonial rule, but also as an impact of a new kind of education system that had been introduced. So, I would be discussing first the regional distribution of various educational institutions for women during the colonial period. In this, one needs to know that it was not as if the education started in a big way in a particular time frame, because as you all know, East India Company was constantly evolving and expanding its scope over India. So, the British had established their presidencies or power centers in the beginning along the coastal line of India. So, they established the Madras Presidency in 1640, and then the Bombay Presidency in 1687, and then finally Bengal Presidency in 1690. Then they acquired Punjab in 1849 after the two Anglo-Sikh wars, and finally they shifted their power center to Delhi in 1912. So, it was a long journey for the Britishers, and as they were establishing themselves in different parts of India, they were also trying to channelize the energies of Indians by devising new ways and means of enhancing their capability by introducing English education and a new kind of education system that would suit their needs. So, first of all, we would be discussing the various educational institutions that developed as a result of British initiatives in North and Northwest India. A number of British schools and colleges had been opened in the 19th century itself in Lahore, Delhi and Jalandhar to create a modern educational influence. And it was not as if only the British initiative was starting educational institutions in India. A lot of initiative also came from indigenous efforts, and in this mention must be made of Arya Samaj, and in 1875 Swami Dayanand Saraswati, who founded Arya Samaj, advocated women's education and widow remarriage in a big way, though the reasons were different and not essentially humanistic or modern in their outlook, a fact that has been discussed earlier. Then Kanya Mahavidyalaya, which was a prominent women's educational center, was opened at Jalandhar in 1891 as a school first, and was later on expanded into college when a larger number of girl students were available to cater to. Also, the system of education in the Arya Samaj institutions was Anglo-Vedic, and thus it derived ideas from both the traditions, that is the Western tradition as well as the Indian tradition, and this became the hallmark of the various educational institutions that were started under the aegis of Arya Samaj. Then coming to Western India, in this region, Bombay emerged as a major power center, and it had been under British rule probably since 1687. So definitely Britishers had a much longer stay here, and they were able to exercise their influence also similarly. The Parsi population in the Western India had always given importance to education, and the women among the Parsi community also participated in the political process. So, the Bombay University, which developed in 1883, it admitted women in various subjects like arts, medicine, civil engineering and law, which was really a path-breaking development. And the first woman to graduate from the Bombay University was Cornelia Sorabji in 1888, and she even went to Oxford to study law. So that was definitely a great achievement as far as the Parsi community was concerned, and also as far as the Indian women were concerned, because she definitely became a symbol of the educated women in India during the colonial period. Now, some other women also graduated at this time. For example, Pandita Ramabai Saraswati, Kashibar Kantikar and Sharda Mehta. Pandita Ramabai, she became a professor at Cheltenham Women's College in England for a brief period, and even went on to learn various subjects like maths, science, geography and Greek, in addition to her mastery over Sanskrit and Indian philosophy. Then similarly, there were women like Kashibai Kantikar who learnt both Marathi as well as English literature at home. And Anandibai Joshi began her education at home, but finally she received a doctorate in medicine from Philadelphia, which was again a huge achievement as far as those times were concerned, and the kind of opportunities that were available to women. Now, these educated women not only wrote autobiographies, but they also edited journals about which we would be discussing in due course of time. Continuing with women development and education in Western India, no one can miss referring to Savitribai Phule, who opened a school for untouchable girls on the 1st May 1847, and she learnt to read and write from her husband Jyoti Rao Phule, who was again committed not only to the cause of social reform but also education of the underprivileged masses. Now, both husband and wife were strong advocates of women's education, caste equality, widow remarriage, and they also struggled against child marriage. Savitribai Phule became the first woman teacher of the first girls' school in Maharashtra, which again was a great achievement. She composed a collection of poems, as many as 41, which were published in 1854 as Kavya Phule. She also published a biography of her husband, which continues to inspire the coming generations of Indians and particularly the downtrodden. Another great achiever in this field was Mary Carpenter, who was a British woman, and she opened a number of branches of National India Association in 1875 to debate on various social issues, especially those related to women, and also particularly related to women education, because women education was still a distant dream for many women, as there were a number of taboos that were attached to the notion of a woman gaining access to education. Pandita Ramabai opened Sharda Sadan on 11th March 1889, which undertook various initiatives in imparting learning and professional training to women, especially widows. This was a great achievement for widows, because now they got access to a place where they could hone their professional skills, and they could also experiment in a new kind of independent living which hitherto was unknown to them. Various women organizations encouraged women to participate in the political process, and this was particularly so in Western India. As you can see from this screenshot, the Grant Medical College, which was opened in 1844, which definitely gave access to a large number of Indians to gain access to higher education, but sadly very few women could develop themselves to the extent that they would gain access to higher education. Then a very important milestone was the University of Bombay. Coming to South India and how education spread in South India, a very important role here was being played by the Christian missionaries, particularly in Madras Presidency. By the 1840s, there were as many as 6 girls' schools which were run by Scottish churches in Madras, and by 1850s, the number of girls enrolled in these schools went up by 8,000. Christian schools and the girls from the upper class Hindu families primarily were included in this number of 8,000 girls, because education was still considered a taboo among the non-Christians as well as among the lower castes, who continued to develop notions of tradition, though here also a welcome change had been initiated in Western India by the initiative of Phule's. The British government started girls' schools in 1871 in Madras, and by 1891, more than 48,000 girls began to go to these schools, and many of these schools, interestingly, were co-educational, which was a very rare phenomenon in 19th century. So a beginning definitely had been made. Then a number of women in Madras even joined the freedom struggle. For example, Durga Bai Deshmukh, Paturi Bala Saraswati Ramanam, Ammu Swaminathan and Lakshmi Sehgal. They became very important political leaders and also kind of supervised various educational initiatives that were being carried on in Madras region. Sister Subba Lakshmi in Madras established a school for high caste widows, which could train them to become not only teachers but also other kind of professions, for example medicine, etc. She herself had been widowed at 11 years of age, and it was her parents that they decided to educate her, and she herself was so much traumatized by the entire experience of widowhood that she wanted to train other girls who were in the same boat, and she wanted to improvise their life. The Theosophical Society under Annie Besant played a vital role in awakening the social and political consciousness, not only among women but also among men, which was again a very important realization. And in Madras Presidency, the headquarters were established at Adyar, and it was started by Colonel Olcott and Madame Blavatsky in 1886. This organization played a very important role not only in the social reforms but also particularly the education of the underprivileged as well as women. The spread of education in East India must refer to specifically what all was taking place in Bengal, and here the efforts were directly linked to British initiatives as well as the efforts of the socio-religious reformers like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Pandit Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, etc. J.E.D. Bethune, the law member and president of the Executive Council and the president of the Council of Education, took personal initiatives and opened the first schools for girls at Calcutta in Bengal Presidency in 1849, and he personally maintained it, which was not only government initiative or government funding, but it was personal funding largely, which kept the school going for a long period. Then in 19th century, a number of important laws had been initiated by William Bentinck, who succeeded in imposing a formal ban on sati in Bengal on 4th of December 1829, thereby initiating a new chapter in history. Raja Ram Mohan Roy, who was born in 1772, also is regarded as a pioneer in spreading awareness regarding women's rights in Bengal, and particularly education, widow remarriage, their right to inherit property, and also against child marriage. And a lot was done in this regard by Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, who was himself a very strong advocate of women's education. Then after this, Rabindranath Tagore worked extensively against mistreatment of women, particularly widows, against child marriage, as well as he kind of ridiculed dowry. The British passed a series of acts against child marriage in 1891 and sanctioned intercaste and intercommunal marriage in 1872, which again was a great change that was going to come about in Indian society, which was deeply ridden in caste, class, linguistic and regional divisions. Now, these acts went a long way in helping the cause of the women, but it was not as if overnight a change would come about. A very important institution in East India was the Hindu College in Calcutta that was started in 1851. Now, moving beyond this description of South, East, West and North, let us talk about a number of other areas which have been documented as far as educational activities for women are concerned. For example, in a region like Manipur, Manipuri society viewed the British education initially with suspicion, as they felt that an outside culture was being superimposed on them. But as missionary activities started in this region, more and more people started adapting themselves to this new kind of education. And initially, though Manipuri women were strictly opposed to Britishers, soon this trend also changed. Initially, there were a series of attacks that had been organized by Manipuri women against British structures. They would either burn them or hit them with sticks. And a very important role in this struggle of women against Britishers was led by Hijam Irabot. But gradually the trend changed and a number of colonial missionary schools developed in this region. Then another very prominent region for educational activity under the colonial period was Simla. Since Simla was the British capital for most part of the year, the missionary activities in Simla were at their peak, and Simla has a number of girls' schools from 19th century onwards, and a very important role in this entire process was played by Michael Wilkinson, who started girls' education at Simla as early as 1848. Then coming to other areas like Uttar Pradesh, Aligarh was a major center of activity of the Muslim League, and Syed Ahmad Khan was the leading advocate of Muslim youth's modern education. But sadly, he was silent as far as education for Muslim women was concerned. And it was as late as 1882 that the Britishers tried to convince Syed Ahmad Khan to support the cause of education for Muslim women. And then there were some changes in attitude, but still the hardening of lines was always there. And despite his opposition, a number of schools were opened by Britishers in UP, and the Muslims girls schools was running in Lucknow since 1868 onwards, and it did capture a large number of Muslim girl students. Then coming to other areas, for example, United Provinces, Firdaus Azmat Siddiqui has pointed out that how a series of schools had been opened in Faizabad, Nawabganj, Pratapgarh, Agra, etc. And most of these schools had been opened with missionary and British support. So definitely the indigenous Muslim leaders' support was largely missing, or it was very slow in coming. And in comparison to Muslim girls studying in schools, very few Hindu girls joined school, as the problem of child marriage was more rampant among Hindus as compared to Muslims. So this was also a major stumbling block on the road to education for Hindu women, and particularly education of high caste Hindu girls. However, Muslim women's participation in the public sphere in Uttar Pradesh, at that time called the United Provinces, was not very visible, and it was very slow in starting, and also there were a number of schools that were started, but they had to be closed in between because of lack of attendance. Now coming to South India, Kerala played a very important role in initiating a number of activities associated with women education. Since Kerala had a society that was largely matrilineal and women enjoyed great importance since pre-modern times in Kerala society, it received modern education quite early, not only due to British support but due to the efforts of Maharani of Travancore, who got an English school opened for girls in the region in 1859. Now this was a huge difference when you compare Kerala to other areas. Here you see that the royalty was herself taking a lot of interest in this initiative, and the cause of women education was being carried on with much greater fervor as compared to the other areas where it was not the indigenous effort only which was important, but also the colonial and missionary activity. But the problem here was that the school was largely attended by the upper class girls students, upper caste girl students, and not by the masses. Now besides the English schools run by the missionaries, there were a number of educational institutions that had been run by the natives of the Kerala. So in addition to royalty, the natives of Kerala were also taking keen interest in initiating education for women. They stressed not only on English but also on the indigenous knowledge system of Kerala, something similar to the initiatives of Arya Samaj, which had started a number of DAV institutions which kind of imbibed both the Western as well as the Indian way of thought, languages, education and subjects. Then talking about initiatives for women education in Kerala, Gauri Srivastava in her study has pointed out that Kerala had some very important visionaries like Sri Narayan Guru, who was born in 1856, who preached Vedic knowledge but also spoke against the caste system. Then Yogakshema Sabha, which was found in Kerala, again treated Vedic knowledge along with modern education as very important, and also insisted on getting rid of unnecessary rituals and taboos. Then another very important scholar in Kerala was Vakum Abdul Qadir Maulvi, who was not only a social reformer, a journalist, a freedom fighter, but also an advocate of modernization of Muslim community. And since Kerala had a large number of a Muslim community, and particularly this kind of initiative was very important as far as education of Muslim girls was concerned. And he not only fought for the freedom but also for the freedom of women to gain access to education in a freer environment. Now this entire trend of schooling was going on along with orthodoxy. This is a very theme that has emerged in course of our discussion. So while in Bengal there was Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, who set up the first girls' school in Calcutta, social ostracization was attempted against him as literacy was supposed to lead to widowhood. It was a notion that if once girls gained access to literacy, if they would start reading and writing, then they would soon lose their husbands and they would become widows. Particularly, this idea was rampant in Bengal, and due to this, there was a lot of emphasis on not teaching girls beyond a point or not teaching them at all. Rasha Sundari Devi, who was herself an upper caste woman, she was a rural housewife, she secretly taught herself the alphabets while doing her household chores, and she wrote her own autobiography in the Bengali language. Then another very important example was Ramabai Ranade, who wrote about the conflict within the homes, the conflict between a man and a woman, and how the so-called liberal husbands forced women to become literate because they wanted to take pride in the fact, without giving an ear to whether their wives were ready or what they would like to do with that education after getting literate. Then educated women soon developed a questioning mind. So even though the overall trend was rampant with orthodoxy, due to some initiatives that had been started, the overall influence was definitely reformatory, and educated women, because they developed a questioning mind, they became critical of their domesticity. So for example, Tarabai Shinde and Pandita Ramabai in Western India and Kailash Bashini Devi in Bengal started criticizing upper caste Hindu households, and this trend is clearly visible in a series of writings that were attempted by them, in the autobiographies that were written by a number of Bengali women. So Pandit Ramabai also was a great critique of what Hindu orthodoxy had done to womankind, and she herself converted to Christianity. Educated women were mocked at in folk art and were projected as masculine and as home breakers. So the overall environment remained almost the same. So while some women were gaining access to education, they were trying to change their lifestyle, they were questioning the older notions, but how the society was viewing them is also very important to understand. So a number of historians have talked about the folk art that was appearing on stage at this time, a number of plays, comedies that were being written, and in these comedies there was a lot of emphasis on how a woman, after gaining access to education, becomes masculine. She loses her beauty, her charm. She starts walking and talking like a man, starts questioning everything which is around her like a man, and ultimately this leads to breaking of homes and everything falls apart. So now the similar theme was projected in a number of comedy dramas as well as tragedies, and the reformist friends and husbands of these educated women were also being ridiculed, and they were also being targeted because it was they only who had initiated this process of change, and they were now projected as weak, feminized, and losing their masculinity in the process of educating their wives, mothers, or daughters. So what emerged out of this entire discussion is that while education was progressing, the overall dilemma of orthodoxy continued to exist. Now, in the next series of discussion, I would be talking about what kind of writings were attempted at this point of time by these educated women. Thank you. during colonial period in India, with the emergence of press and the publication of magazines, a new trend started that was not only a result of the socio-religious reform movements, but also due to the publication industry that was going to take off. The socio-religious reforms and the Renaissance movements were very much restricted by the ideologies of patriarchy and caste, and also by the middle class foundations. But a positive initiative that was being taken by these new movements was the use of print culture. And this use of print culture not only gave access to women to these various magazines, articles, journals, essays, debates, etc., but also gave an opportunity to publish themselves and to put their own thoughts and ideas on paper, which would then be read by number of other females. So a number of newspapers and magazines began acting as an agency of Indian nationalism, as well as a tool of modernization, Western education, and new ways of thoughts and learning. A number of women's magazines that appeared during this period, particularly from late 19th century onwards, they began focusing on various problems like female infanticide, child marriage, parda system, and illiteracy among women. Now, once women started writing about these basic issues that were ruining their life, then problems came in the public domain, and since more people were reading about them, they were also getting convinced of new ways of thinking and new ways of action. So things that were earlier considered as impossible or as undesirable now began to be accepted with greater fervor. Many Indian women started editing women's journals since 1850s, and women's magazines and their efforts in changing the roles of women both in the public and private sphere needs detailed discussion, because this is the logical culmination of various educational activities that had been initiated, as we have just discussed. So education was not only to gain access to literacy or to acquire a degree, but also to think, to start writing, to start questioning, and to start inspiring others. And this is precisely what these women journals and magazines were doing in the course of 19th and 20th centuries. So a number of women's magazines that were initiated by the Western educated middle class and upper class women of Indian society who wanted to eradicate illiteracy became widely in circulation, and the educated women not only tried to get new space in home as well as in the public sphere by contesting the gender issues through their writings, but this also created a benchmark for other women to fall in line. Most of the magazines which appeared during this phase, during the early phase, that is by mid 19th century onwards, focused on the issue of Victorian domesticity, which in itself was a regressive thought process which emphasized on how and why women should continue to take care of domestic lives, of domestic bonds, and how they should be adjustable and well groomed. But then at least women were getting a taste of writing in the public domain, and they were also inspiring other women to talk about education, even if it was mired in the thought process of Victorian domesticity. As has been pointed out by V. Ramakrishna, the male editors of a number of Telugu women magazines focused on the morality, the moral conduct of women, and the necessity of women to make compromises for families' happiness. So a series of articles, stories, plays, etc. were devised, and they were published in these magazines. And the central theme was not to modernize women or to open up their horizons or to instill knowledge of science and technology, but to instill notions of domesticity and also to instill in them the idea that even if they were educated, they had to remain moral. They were the moral torchbearers of the family and of the larger society and also of Indian nation that was going to come on its own. Now, these women magazines were not published in any one particular language, but a series of vernacular magazines started emerging in various regional areas. Women editors provided a space for the female readers not only to share their experience and also initiated discussions on women's issues, but they also justified the domestic roles that now had to be performed with greater efficiency by these educated women, because ultimately they must be different from the uneducated women who were probably not that well versed in issues of hygiene, health, etc. So these magazines, which were edited both by men and women, published various articles about sewing, knitting, cooking, chicken embroidery, and urged women to use their free time usefully in socially useful activities and not only in wasting their time over fun or activities that were enjoyed by the British Mem Sahibs, because these British Mem Sahibs were ultimately eroding the morality that had to be there among Indian women. They celebrated nationalism and encouraged women to not only participate in the freedom struggle, but also publish articles related to nationalism, patriotism, and anti-colonialism, boycotting foreign goods, and also promoting Swadeshi, etc. So the agenda was very clear. The idea was to project through these magazines and journals the image of an ideal Indian woman who was well versed in domesticity and was all out for national activities and nothing more. Coming to next important discussion that is very closely related to the issue of publication of magazines, etc., is a number of women's organizations that had started developing during 19th and 20th century, particularly in the beginning of 20th century. So from 1910 to 1920, women's organizations that were constituted were largely local or regional women's organizations. For example, Bang Mahila Samaj and Nari Samiti in Bengal. Then there were also a number of organizations that were coming up in Maharashtra, for example, the Satara Sabha, then in Bangalore, Mahila Seva Samaj, and in Banaras, Bharat Mahila Parishad, and in Allahabad, Prayag Mahila Samiti. So these organizations were definitely giving an agency to women, and they were also patronizing the new ways of writings and thoughts that were going to project women in a new way. Then also it is important that what role these women organizations were playing as far as women writings were concerned. Most of these organizations, they patronized women who read papers in conferences on topics like the Hindu wife and what she should be, or on female education, or the place of women in modern India, or mother's worship, how women need to be worshipped, how great they are, or how great they need to become. Then some articles or papers that were published or which were read were also about the responsibilities of our sex. Then Grahasth Ashram, then Pativrata Dharam, childbirth, and injurious effects of child marriage, as well as the duty of Indian women in the modern age. So as you can see, most of these themes belong to a particular genre, and they restricted again women to family, domesticity, and nation. By 1908, the first attempts of coming together of women on a national level were made, interestingly, in a Mahila Parishad or a ladies' congress at Madras, which was attended by a number of women, not only from South India, but also other parts of the country. And in this, there were almost 19 papers that were presented in various languages like Marathi, English, Tamil, Malayalam, Telugu. But sadly, the themes of most of these papers were what has been discussed so far. Then in 1910, a very important development that was initiated was by Sarla Devi, who founded Bharat Istri Mahamandal with the aim of forming an all India women's organization, but she was unsuccessful as the mobilization could not be complete. And it was ultimately in 1917 that Annie Besant founded Women's Indian Association, which can be called the first women's organization of an all India character. So this was definitely a great development, because till now whatever organizations existed of women in India were largely local or regional, and this was the first all India level organization that was started in 1917 onwards. Now this also brought about a change in the very nature of women's organization, and in the Calcutta Congress session of 1917, for the first time there was an emphasis, a detailed emphasis on the role of women in the national movement. So while Congress had been established in 1885, it took almost more than 25 years for men to realize that women can play such an important role in the national movement, and their role needs to be validated and accounted for. And it was henceforth that consciousness of women's rights was on the rise, and definitely a very important role in this entire process was played by these various organizations that were demanding a separate voice for women and also insisted on the voice to be heard. Now coming to the history of women's writings, one can talk about three phases, and it is in these three phases that these writings can be discussed and clubbed. So the first phase that we can talk about was the Reformist phase, which was in the 19th century, particularly mid half of 19th centuries onwards. Then the second phase can be described as the Radical phase. This was a very critical phase which can be discussed as having begun by the beginning of the 20th century, as most journals appeared during this period, and the journals that appeared during this period, they questioned society, the values of society, gender roles, the spheres of activity, and also they became vehicles of politicization, thereby exposing women to a new public sphere. And then the third phase was the post-independence, which again insisted on domestic concerns, and after independence, women could play a far more active and a far more creative role in making the nation strong. Now our discussion would largely focus on the first two phases. Coming to phase one, that is the Reformist phase. In this, we would be talking about the publication of various women's magazines in India during the colonial period as a part of socio-religious reform movements. So these magazines not only provided a platform to women to express their point of views, but they also encouraged the whole idea of female education. They not only published articles about the status of women from India, but also about other countries, thereby exposing to women what was different among various women of different countries, and how Western sensibilities were so very different from Indian sensibilities, and also raised questions of rights and duties. Then a very interesting development that started was the beginning of the first magazine known as Bal Bodhi. This was the first women's magazine in Hindi language that was edited by a male reformer, Bharatendu Harish Chandra, in 1874. So the first women magazine was not started by a woman but by a male reformer. Now, as has been discussed by Sonal Shukla, the social reformers and the cultural revivalists of the 19th century published women magazines to educate and train women for the new roles assigned to women. So everything was pre-decided, nothing was left to the wish of women, their views were not taken into account, and all the articles that were being published also had a set agenda. As has been pointed out by Himani Banerjee, women magazines acted as a modern communicative space but with some limitations. There was definitely a development of vernacular language, culture and the growth of nationalism, as most of these articles were not about liberty of women but about freedom of the country and how women can play a very important role in bringing about that reality. As has been pointed out by Leela Gandhi, British were maintaining their control over the natives by controlling the textuality. So the entire notion of textuality needs to be understood from that perspective. The Indian educated middle class intelligentsia recognized the importance of text, recognized the importance of the print, and they also wanted to make full use of the print media by initiating a number of written articles, and how they could encounter colonialism through these writings had a great impact on the way women's roles were being perceived and written about in these various magazines and journals. Indian initiative to print and publish magazines and journals also began with the aim to reform the Indian society. So reformism as well as nationalism continued to be the twin focus of these women magazines, but with certain riders. As has been pointed out by Bipin Chandra in 1988, the colonial government realized the importance of the press and also the freedom struggle that was going on in India. Therefore, from time to time, they would attempt the curtailment of the press, and they shut down almost 98 printing presses and took action against Indian journalists in 1932, when the Indian national movement was at its peak and when Mahatma Gandhi had given a call for the civil disobedience movement. So definitely there is no denying the fact that the print culture, the print media was very important and very crucial to understand any kind of political, social or cultural change that was going to take place in India. So when one is talking about the role of women in history or the different phases in history where women made their mark, one has to talk about print media and how women expressed their own views through this medium. As has been pointed out by Sumit Sarkar, women's question in the social reform movement failed to liberalize women, as women were further caught up in the web of culture, in the web of expectations, tradition, purity, motherhood, family, piety, etc. So most of these writings, they began projecting women as the makers of the Indian nation who were going to align themselves against the foreign rule. So the Indian text projected women as devoted wives and self-sacrificial mothers whose sacrifice would carry forward the nation to the next level of purity, to the next level of freedom, and this would bring about a greatness that was truly Indian, that was going to be truly indigenous. So the reformers tried to challenge the social customs which adversely affected the condition of women through their writings, but at the same time they did not question patriarchy and gender relations in the family. And the similar trend appears in these magazines and journals also, with some exceptions here and there. Now coming to the aspect of women's agency, these magazines and various organizations that we have discussed so far definitely opened up the Pandora for women's agency, and by the end of 19th century, the Western educated women reformers and women's organizations started making their mark on the entire socio-cultural and political process that was going on. As had been pointed out by Swarna Kumari Devi in 1886 when she found Ladies Association, and Pandita Ramabai when she started Sarada Sadan in 1892, as well as Ramabai Ranade when she found Hindu Ladies Social and Literary Club in 1902 and Seva Sadan in 1909 in Pune. A lot needed to be done by women for women, because till now the reins of the movements had been taken over by men, so some change needed to be brought about to bring about a cultural shift. Women reformers' perspective was also somewhat different from the male perspective, but here also one cannot really emphatically say that it was completely different, because while they were questioning various social evils, they were also insisting on the image of idealism, which was very dear to women during 19th, 20th centuries. Now, coming to the discussion as to how these various women's magazines, journals and writings, they came to symbolize different phases of colonialism. A lot has been discussed in this regard by Orsini. Orsini, who wrote in 1999, has pointed out that how one can talk of three journals, and how these three journals, they represented the three different phases of colonialism. So the first journal that he talks about is Griha Lakshmi, which was edited by Gopala Devi. This was about reforming women and instilling domesticity with an improved version. So the idea of Sugrahini, that is an ideal domestic wife, a perfect housewife, was projected in this journal. Then the next was Istri Darpan, which was edited by Rameshwari Nehru. In this, the idea that education, political awakening and gender relations needed to be altered was now increasingly discussed openly. It was quite different from Griha Lakshmi. So this journal was of a different genre somewhat, and the Istri Darpan, while it was more focused on education, it was also opposed to only the domestic role, and it was also questioning that why women's education should limit them only to domesticity, and it also questioned evil practices like parda. Then another very important achievement of this journal was that it started publishing autobiographies of women, that is how common women felt, and all those who had been able to read and write their autobiographies, it gave them a chance to publish them, and these biographies and autobiographies definitely went a long way in inspiring other women. Then the third phase, according to Orsini, is represented by the journal Chand, which promoted women organizations and participation in public sphere. It projected women as active subjects and not only as passive recipients of education, and also promoted civil and political consciousness. So this was also a next step that definitely represented a welcome change. Now, a very important piece of writings that one must discuss in somewhat detail are the autobiographies. So hitherto we have discussed journals and magazines. Now coming to the issue of autobiographies, this is a very interesting subject, and these autobiographies, according to many historians, were the examples of feminist writings in the early 19th centuries, and they were largely the accounts of the personal lives of the women. Bengali and Marathi women took a lead in writing these autobiographies, and these autobiographies vividly describe the personal life stories, the journeys, the experiences of these women of 19th century. most of these autobiographies are also kind of confessions, the stories of struggle which these women underwent. They have kind of written them with great empathy, and also they have inspired generations of women who were going to read them. And the most important theme that emerges out of these autobiographies is that how a woman emerges as an individual, because in these works the woman is not writing for the nation, she is not writing for any organization, she is writing to give a vent to her own feelings, sharing her own experiences. So this very idea of own, the individual, the me, how I underwent change, what I experienced, when that is put into writing and when that is published, it brings about a different kind of an experience, not only among the writer but also among the readers. So again, these autobiographies need to be read and written about with that kind of perspective on hand. Then these autobiographies also explained the limited world of these women, the household, that showered love and respect that they got from their liberal elite husbands, and also what all efforts they were putting in educating their children and in adopting manners, ways and means of the colonial period. Now, in the next lecture, I would be discussing in detail about these autobiographies and some other content of some magazines and journals. Thanks a lot.
With this note, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much for giving us a very, very productive session on women education and writing. And dear friends, we believe that you might have enjoyed today's lecture. And if you want to grab more, if you have missed out some of the part, then we would like to tell you all that very soon we are going to upload this lecture on YouTube. If you have any queries or if you want to give your feedback for this particular lecture, then do write to us at info.cec@nic.in. All the lectures pertaining to the series are there for you on YouTube under the playlist Women and History. Do watch them, do write to us. We would be meeting again very soon and would be discussing further. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Geetika.